And we welcome you into this special edition. You may call it the Fast Lane. You may call it the NASCAR Betting Podcast. It is the NASCAR visionary, Jeff Quiandro, joining us here as we look ahead to the spring 2021 NASCAR Cup race at Talladega Superspeedway. Jeff, first of all, a pleasure to be launching this with you and appreciate all of our listeners and viewers bearing with us as we work through this new project.
Absolutely. A lot of thanks to all the NASCAR listeners and bettors, that are just getting started up or perhaps from another sport, and they want to take a fresh look at a sport like NASCAR that offers a lot of great value and some really interesting analytics.
And I'm sure we'll go through a lot of it, whether it's your philosophy, your background, and everything else. Just give us a quick update on your history of betting in NASCAR and what's gotten you to this point.
Well, let's see. I've been betting on NASCAR for, at least 25 years. And started out, just watching races and got a little bit more interested, and then started to learn to apply some analytics from other sports into NASCAR, and found it just to have a bevy of excitement when it comes to wagering. At the end of the day, people like to bet baseball, they bet basketball, they bet the NFL. Betting NASCAR is exactly the same thing, okay? The bad beats happen, the great wins happen, all those things occur in a race. And we all see how dramatic races can change. Well, you have that bit of sort of built-in pre-excitement into NASCAR wagering. And, if you watch your numbers, you can get some good bargains and be a sharp handicapper.
You mentioned that, and we'll get into this, I'm sure, even more so on just different points for how people can bet NASCAR, have fun doing it. And of course, having fun often comes from finding a way to generate a profit off of it. But it's interesting because you have a history of doing this with head-to-head matchups, and certainly that's been one of your fortes. But as we look ahead to the NASCAR race weekend at Talladega Superspeedway and the superspeedways in general, Daytona and Talladega, we can get into other courses in a moment, but how does your philosophy change for something like this weekend?
Well, 4 races a year at this point, the philosophy changes, and that's when we're at Daytona and Talladega. And the reason why it changes is because we see the attrition level so great at a super speedway or a former restrictor plate track. Oftentimes, as many as 50 to 60% of the cars don't finish on the lead lap. And we both know that if you're racing at Daytona or Talladega and you don't finish on the lead lap, then there's probably been some sort of incident or damage to your car that is preventing such a thing. So at other tracks, we see the attrition is much lower and there's more value in a head-to-head matchup. But if you know right out of the gate that 50% of the cars are probably going to be out of contention by the end of the race, then that value really dissipates from a head-to-head, and then in turn, it transfers over to a race winner, where we both know at Daytona or Talladega, virtually anybody has a shot to win.
Well, and we saw it at the Daytona 500 with a long shot Michael McDowell there. And even though Ryan Blaney won this race last year, it was run a little bit later because of the COVID pandemic, pushing it into the summer. But at Talladega, we saw at other points where longer shots were in contention and had a very realistic chance to win, which brings us to one of the interesting points. Shopping has become a real common term in my life. I'm married now, happily married, but my wife loves to shop. Now I get why, because in sports betting, we get to do the same thing and we get to go looking at odds. And it can vary for a race like this at Talladega. When you're looking at it, do you group them into particular categories in terms of favorites, mid shots, long shots? How do you go about looking at your winners that you project? Because it can come from any of those groupings, it seems.
Well, and you're right, it definitely can. I think that there's strength in numbers, and I look for a team of drivers. Again, with the attrition level being somewhere around 50% or higher, you want to have a couple of drivers still around late in the race, even if things haven't gone your way, because then there's a chance they could possibly pull it out if they're in contention. That opens itself up to a much greater range of winners. Anybody from a Logano or a Hamlin or Blaney at 12-1, all the way down to someone like Eric Jones, who we're seeing at 80-1. These things can happen. It's important to have a driver that takes good care of his equipment on these tracks, and hopefully they're around late in the race.
So it's interesting you bring this up because the term crapshoot is often thrown around with super speedway races. If I'm not mistaken, though, and I thought you mentioned this And I'll give a shout out to Gil Alexander on the Vegas Stats and Information Network, VSiN. But I think on your appearance with him today, this Friday, you mentioned certain drivers that have a knack for staying clean. How do you factor something like that into your handicapping? Is it analytics based? Is it just having had a feel for different drivers around? And, do you view it as a 50-50 proposition, or is there a legitimate skill with that?
No, I don't know if there's a legitimate skill, but I don't think it's 50-50 either. You take a driver, let's just take Eric Almirola, for example. Now, he ended last year's race early. There's no doubt about that. But in the previous 5 out of the last 6, he's had incredible runs where his worst finish, I think, is 7th or 8th. I mean, just great runs around late. We've seen Kurt Busch as well, another driver who tends to be around. Then we see drivers who are highly skilled, but somehow they end up getting collected race after race. And one of those drivers is Brad Keselowski. So it really, I think you've got to weigh the odds along with your viability to be around late. And of course, you can never really predict it, but it doesn't hurt to stick with the guys who have performed well at Daytona and Talladega by being around at the finish.
Jeff, as you're looking at a particular race like Talladega, do you blend your research of Daytona and Talladega when handicapping super speedways, or do you, only use one, or do you kind of use both but weight the race that they're at more heavily?
I think you use both. You have to take both under consideration, but there's a very clear distinction between the 2 tracks. Okay, when you take a look at the past winners at Talladega, you've got Denny Hamlin, okay? Then you got Ryan Blaney the 2 races before that. You've got Logano, you got Elliott thrown in there. Those drivers were all about 12-1, okay? Maybe 14-1, depending where you shopped. Those were all considered favorites. When you look at Daytona, all I have to say is Michael McDowell, okay? And we saw him at 100-1. We see that again and again and again. I can think of Ryan Newman, who we had years ago, 37-1, Daytona 500. Not to say that your Justin Haley's can't happen, okay, at Talladega. Talladega is a little bit more reserved, and we tend to see the guys who are a little closer to the top of the odds sheet bring home the checker.
So you now look at that, and you mentioned closer to the top of the odds sheet, but we can see the mid or the long shots in this race. This is the part that I'm sure the audience is most excited for. But when you run down each of them, everyone dreams of cashing that big 100-1 ticket, even if it's $10. That's $1,000. Everyone would love to have that. And if you are more comfortable with more, you can get a bigger payout. But there's also a reason why they're longer shots. So you mentioned that when you're looking at each of those tiers, the short shots, the mid shots, and the long shots to win, do you put the same bankroll on each of those, or do you divide that up differently because of obviously the probabilities?
Great question. I think that you have a target in mind of what you're willing to risk, okay? And then you sort of balance that out. So no matter how it falls, you would get approximately the same payout. Okay, so you might put what someone would consider 3 or 4 units on one driver, but then it may be as little as a half a unit on a driver who was 40-1 or 50-1, a longer shot. So your payout, potential payouts, generally are sort of in line with one another. It doesn't hurt if you feel strongly about value on one driver or another. If that's really what you think, then it's okay to put maybe a little bit more on that driver and subtract from some of the others. You can play it any way you like. You got to go with what you really think about this, and then just try to manage your risk accordingly.
It's interesting you bring all those particular points up, Jeff. Now's the fun time, picks time. Starting off with the shortest shots, who's got your attention the most this weekend at Talladega?
Well, when you look at the favorites, you've got Denny Hamlin, Joey Logano, Chase Elliott, Kyle Larson, Blaney, all in the 10-12-1 range. Hamlin seems to be the odds-on favorite amongst most of the books, with the others falling in shortly after. Of the top picks, I like Ryan Blaney. I can find him at 14-1 at some shops, or as low as 10-1. So depending where you find him, obviously at 14-1, I think Ryan Blaney, he has 2 wins there. He's, just a very good super speedway racer at Talladega or Daytona. So I like him as a top shot. Now,
To the mid shots, who's in that category?
Well, then, you've got some viable talent there. And I'm going to start right out with Eric Almirola and Austin Dillon. 22 to 24 to 1, depending where you shop. Like I said, Almirola had an early exit in October, but he has a win, and he's just so solid when it comes to finishing these races. I know he hasn't had the best of years, but if he avoids trouble, this is his kind of race. We've seen Austin Dillon perform well, obviously, at Daytona. And, he finished sixth last year in this race. And I just seeing what he has to offer, I think both him and his partner, Tyler Reddick, are going to be stout.
So you like those two. You like Almirola. You like Tyler Reddick and Austin Dillon as options in the mid-tier. You mentioned obviously Ryan Blaney at the front of the field. Who are the longer shots that have got your attention for this one?
Well, I think the longer shots, one of them could be Tyler Reddick, depending where you shop. We saw him as much as 80 to 1 yesterday. He's been bet down to 40 to 1 at the same sports book, and we're seeing him at 20 to 1 at some of the major Las Vegas books currently. So you could really shop Tyler Reddick, and if you could find him potentially at 40 or 50 to 1. So I like to throw him in there. And the other ones I like are Ryan Newman. Again, he has a top 7 finish in 3 out of the last 4 at Talladega, 50 to 1, big odds. We see Newman up front a lot at Daytona and Talladega. If you want to go really deep, Eric Jones, 80 to 1, depending where you shop him. The Superbook in Las Vegas has him currently still at 80 to 1. He's a little bit lower at 65 to 1 over at the Circa. But again, he's finished second and fourth in the last 2 races at Talladega. He's in a Richard Petty racing car. We know their super speedway program has been good for years. Okay, and this is the same car that Eric Almirola won in same program that Eric Almirola won in just a few years ago. So I like those long shots.
Tons of fun value that are there, of course, for all the insight. NASCAR Visionary is the Twitter handle for Jeff Quiandro. I'm at Fast Lane Ed Lane. If you want to check it out there, it's all the social media platforms across the board, and just throw in @gmail.com to send us an email that way. Jeff, great to have this. This is exciting. Looking forward to doing more of these.
Absolutely. Just really enjoyable. I'd love to get out and talk about NASCAR and sort of demystify it, because we have a lot of NASCAR fans who are new into sports wagering. And then we have the young analytics-based handicappers that are looking for a sport like this, and they probably don't know how well it exists. But NASCAR is made by numbers, as we all know.
Yeah, so much. And, hopefully if they open up practice and qualifying, there's even more data
Yes.
that can go into that. And I'm sure we'll get into that. We'll get into the analytics. There are a lot of other areas. If you have a question, fastlaneedlane@gmail.com, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram to get with me, and we'll get it to Jeff. Or if you want to just hit him up directly, NASCAR Visionary is the Twitter handle. Jeff, thank you for doing this. This is awesome.
Ed, wonderful. Great to see you again. Take care.